Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first episode of ESG in Space. My name is Nishan Degnarain. I'm one of your hosts today. I'm delighted to be joined by...
I'm Miki, Sode, and we are happy to be here, and we're happy that you're here.
Fantastic. And today we're grateful to our partners, the Exponential Academy and Secure World Foundation. And the theme of this series of podcasts is to talk about whether we need some sort of sustainability or ESG framework for space, or is it fine for the space industry to continue developing as it is with the development of the private space industry? Our special guest for this podcast is, and I'm delighted to introduce, is our friend Bruno Sánchez-Andrade Nuño. Bruno has got a long and storied history. He's a scientist, he's an author, he's a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. He was the founder of the planetary computer work at Microsoft. He's been a scientist working on satellite and AI technology at the World Bank. He was a chief scientist at Mapbox, looking at various mapping projects that uses satellites, and the author of a book called Impact Science and how science can have a positive impact on the world. And today he is the executive director and founder of Clay, which is using artificial intelligence, open source and open access data for satellite imagery for good. With that, Bruno, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miki and Nishan. I'm really excited to talk with you about these issues.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Wonderful. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for coming onto our show. And should we just dive right in? Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay. All right. So I have a first question, and it could be a kind of intro into setting the context. And I know you have an extensive background working at Microsoft, but it's always around like mapping the Earth, right? And now you started this nonprofit organization, Clay, about a year ago. Can you tell us what Clay does? Like, how does it work, and what inspired you to start Clay?
Well, it's a long time coming dream to work on these issues. It's the confluence of a lot of pain points and challenges I saw during my career. Like Nissan was saying, I helped create a company like Mapbox. It was a startup, or large corporations like Microsoft, the planetary computer, which is about putting the data together, but also work at the World Bank for a while and how to maximize the social impact of these technologies. And it has always been, and it is really difficult to use that data. Like, we have data of the entire world, of the things in the background. We have literally data of every place on Earth for the last decades, but it's still really hard to use it. Like, the answer of questions like how many trees are there in the world, or where there are fires. Like, for example, now in Portugal, there are lots of fires happening, or floods also across Europe. The data of that, it's there. And it's there either from public sources, like Sentinel in Europe, or NASA Landsat, or commercial companies. This is not about commercial or versus not commercial. It's about then using that data. And what we realized a year ago is that this last wave of AI, it's gonna unlock that. The beauty of one of the beauties of this revolution in the case of text is not so much that it's something new, but it is that it reduces or removes the barrier of knowledge. Like, if I want to learn quantum physics in Swahili, I can do that with ChatGPT or other methods. So what is the equivalent of Earth? What is the equivalent of putting that knowledge or that awareness of Earth? And what happens if we do it as a nonprofit? So that is not only those who have access to the budgets. Like, for example, right now, a lot of the models are done commercially, and that's perfect. That's great. It generates a lot of profits and values and services that are important. But then, what would happen if we do this as a nonprofit to unlock impact in the world, but also unlock investments of companies that build on that? And that's what we did. That's basically Clay.
So this is fascinating. You're innovating in two areas, right? So you're innovating, number one, in terms of how do you use the application of space or satellite technologies for good, right, for purpose. So you're innovating on the business model, right, that you can look as a non-profit, philanthropically funded, not a government-funded project, not a funded project. So that is fascinating. I mean, can you give us maybe a 60-second demonstration of what Clay is, just to so we can see
and by the way, also to use the ESG acronym, the G of governance, this is the one we are not innovating, but we are struggling with. It is not clear what is the right governance for a non-profit AI tool. That is something that we are really explicitly saying. So we want to innovate in the business model to unlock a lot of value, commercially or not. But we also would like to be smarter about the governance of these things. And we just don't know. I think the non-profit governance, how it was designed, was not meant for technology in general, but for AI in particular. And that's something we're struggling. So a shout out to all the audience here is that if you are experts on governance of AI tools, we are struggling with that. Because what we're building is clearly extremely powerful, but also we want to make sure that it benefits the most people. And to answer your question, Nishan, if we can, there's a demo that I will do in a second, and I will speak what we see while we demo that, so that those who are listening to this also get the idea. So if you go to the tool, if we can put the screen, there you go. You can go to it to explore.madewithclay.org. That's the demonstration product. And what it looks like a map. And you can select certain regions, and it basically allows you to zoom in a place. And the idea here is that this is a special map. And it's a special map because it understands what it's looking at. And what I mean by that is that I'm scrolling to a semi-random place because I've done this a few times. And I click on a solar panel. I know this is a solar panel in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and I click on it. And basically I'm telling the AI, that thing that I'm clicking, I want more of those. And traditionally, this would be computer vision, and you would need to create a whole complex environment from pixels to solar panels to find more of those. But with these AI tools, because it understands the concepts that is looking at through these examples, immediately in like 100 milliseconds, it found me 5 other examples, 500 because that's the limit I put, 500 other examples of solar panels. And it's remarkably good. I am scrolling through the examples, and all of them are correct. But imagine some were not correct. Like, for example, this one down in the results is not a solar panel. So I basically click, this is not what I'm looking for, this is what I'm looking for, and I click again, find similar. What I'm doing is I'm telling the AI what is my intent, what is the thing I'm looking for. And in like a couple of iterations of a human in the loop, I'm finding that. But that's not the value. The value is that just like for solar panels, you can do exactly the same for swimming pools, for biomass of the forest, for floods, for fires, for all of those things we had in our images. Now we can index them, we can find them. And if we do this again as a nonprofit, that allows anyone to use this, combined with the petabytes of open data we have, we basically revolutionize the expectations of what anyone can know about Earth.
And you're rewarding, so now let Miki come in, and you're rewarding satellite image providers and other Earth observation data providers in some way by being part of the Clay system, I'm assuming, just so that they can showcase, because I'm assuming a lot of this data otherwise by private providers would have been behind paywalls and not accessible for scientists or those from the global south, those who can't afford to pay the high fees.
So what we're seeing here, and what we used Clay to train, we've trained Clay only with open data, so that the result is also an open model, which means that there is no restrictions or licensing. Like we have problems with text models of AI trained on text. There is a whole discussion about IP and licensing, but because we only use open data for Clay, we can do whatever we want, including private commercial satellite company can take Clay and continue training with their own data to make it even better. But there are things we cannot see in open data that we could see in commercial data. Not only that, you can use Clay, trained or not, with their commercial data to index, so that not only I know solar panels as seen from open data, I can also search for solar panels as seen in commercial data in places I might not have, or times I might not have access with open data. So it surfaces, basically, it makes, the analogy that I sometimes use is that we have a library of books in a language we cannot read, so that it's really hard to find the right page. Now we have an AI tool that has read all the books and can tell you exactly what book to go to find what you're looking for.
So one question then, I promise, Miki. so with this assumes a couple of things, right? It assumes that you have some sort of interoperable standards, right? Mm-hmm. Because you have found a way, with your base map, to ensure that there is some sort of interface or intermediary. Mm-hmm. You have imagery that can be geolocated to certain areas. Yeah. The file types are interoperable. I'm assuming if you take, so somehow, the industry has created that. And I'm assuming there are some areas which are proprietary data that's not interoperable. And so they can't be included. And there'll be others that will be developed maybe from other nations, for example, that have a different set of standards that will not be interoperable here. I mean, how are you create, because that's one of the big challenges when we talk about the ESG and even standardization. We see that recently with the astronauts stuck right now in the space, the ISS, the space station, because they were on a Boeing craft, and SpaceX is a different. So how are you thinking, how do standards get created in this industry? And is there a need for some sort of standard setting body for this sort of work? This
is only possible, or the reason this is much easier to do than text is because there are already standards of data formats that are cloud friendly and very AI friendly. So that already is possible because of existing standards. But because this geo AI thing is so new, there are also lack of standards for many use cases, many applications, like model definitions or output definitions of these embeddings, which is this AI summaries. So we don't have those standards. So again, being a nonprofit puts you in a special position to help set the standard. Because if now anyone can use Clay, either with or without fine-tune or commercial, then we can start saying as a de facto that Clay is the standard or could be the standard, and we're happy to shape the outputs and talk with the partners to say, hey, if we do this rate, then it would be easy or more interoperable. So yes, the standards are really important. In some cases, it's possible because there are standards, but we're also discovering that this is all so new that there's no standards, because this is terra incognita. This is something extremely new we don't really understand well, which also connects to the governance. Who should be on the table talking about these issues? Who should be, is the places, like when we work in indigenous communities, it's good that they could use the model because it's an open model, but do they know how to use the model? We get their input, so we make sure that they benefit not only from the model landing on them, but also from the work and the knowledge they have locally to make the models better, those kind of questions.
So let's talk about the community, right? And then who should be in this conversation. We did touch upon commercial satellite imagery providers, but how about the user side, right? Can you tell us more about who are the early users for the Clay platform? Because if I remember correctly, Google Earth Engine, I think it was forestry people who kind of latched onto it. Because the reason why I bring that up is there would be first wave of people trying to use it, and then that will be a bigger voice, I guess. And then as the other people will come in, that will kind of form a community. But I kind of wanted to get the sense of who see an immediate value in what Clay has to offer that's different from other platform, and that could be kind of get a glimpse of what might transpire from now on.
Yeah, it's also a very good question, Miki, and not only that, but it's a cleaner slate in text models or visual models or audio models, there is already the customers and the expectations and the stories, good and not so good, to shape the narrative. But with AI for Earth, it's less common. So there is a more opportunity of what users do we talk about here to shape the expectations. Are these defense and intelligence customers, which, for example, dominated the whole story of remote sensing from the beginning because they were how the industry basically got started? Or is it more on environmental issues or social issues, right? So the real customers of the model that we started with, the first one was biomass estimates. One of the things that is extremely important is to have really good measures of how many tons of how many tons of carbon are captured, for example, with forests. So we can create carbon credits, so we can sell those carbon credits, the quality of those carbon credits, all of those things. It takes a lot of effort to do that properly, to literally go to the forest and measure the diameter of the trees. So there are many ways using satellite images and using other methods to speed it up. And now, with models like Clay, you can take the example of a few places that we've done that manually or with other methods, and then train an AI model to use those semantics it has learned to speed up the process. And what we are seeing is that we need far fewer examples than traditionally to make the same or 90% accuracy of the same outputs hundreds or 1,000 times faster. And because it's an open model that third parties can assess, I can test, then we can set the standard, which is an independent from the model provider or the creator of the credit. So that to me is a fantastic story. And by the way, similar stories exist for weather forecasts or for other cases where we see AI models being a cost play, basically doing things cheaper or doing things even better, faster. That's basically the stories we want to highlight. There's another story of a predecessor of Clay, which is a product called Earth Index, which is a similar technique, which was used to detect illegal mining, and it was the front page of the New York Times. It's a fantastic story how, with a few examples of illegal mining in the Amazon, because we have contacts in the Amazon to say, hey, I know there are illegal miners in here. Can you use your AI to find other places that might be illegal mining or strips of to land planes? And they did, and they discovered more. And that's, again, another good story that highlights the social value, not just the commercial or corporate or mining or defense, which has its own users and its own benefits and its own challenges. But that's not how we want to shape this story.
And because it's interesting, a lot of the premise of how this podcast came about has been, what will it take for the space economy to grow, right? Up until the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, the space industry was dominated by nation states, right? The US, Soviet Union / Russia, emerging country, Japan, European Space Agency, now China and Israel and India and other nations. But then since the SpaceX prize, we now have the launch of the private space industry. And in this conversation we had before this podcast, you had mentioned that a lot of the space industry is either dominated by the defense industry, right, by science, and now we have the struggle for kind of what does a viable commercial sector look like. And even in that viable commercial sector, this is a clear case of where you're trying to use an economy for good, right? We've been very extractive in some of the other private sector practices. I mean, do you see companies being rewarded for putting up technologies into space that kind of a beneficial impact? Can we create business models, for example, that can track, as you said, whether it's methane emissions or whether it's illegal fishing activities? Like, how do we incentivize that sort of activities?
In a way, it's like a carbon credit, right? You need to be able to track to see your carbon footprint and impact to the environment and stuff. Like, can we extend to think like, as we are going to outer space, are we keeping the space environment in as good of a environment as we found it, in a way, right? Like, so that longer term, we can all have an access and benefit from what unique value that space offers, what the value is a big question. But
this is definitely a complex issue. So it's good that this kind of podcast exists, because you can think about the sustainability of a space in the sense of keeping the commons of a space in good shape, so that there is an equal opportunity, so there's maximize the impact for the most amount of people, things like debris in orbit and things like that, right? That's a whole set of issues. But also sustainability on Earth using space assets. It's not only the liabilities of being in space, it's also the opportunities of being in space, or even the cost of not doing a space. Like if we were not in a space, we were not able to do the things we can do commercially or not, we would be in a poor place to understand what's happening on Earth. So sustainability on Earth depends more and more on space assets. So we should also incentivize those things. And then, of course, the question of by who? Of course, right now, the largest operator of communications and images of space are private companies like Planet and SpaceX with Starlink. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What is the governance around those things? Like if it were nation states, like before it used to be the US, basically, as a country doing these constellations, it might seem that is easier and better governance, but also a set of values that also dominate in a space. It's a whole other conversation. How to ensure that the governance of a space, when it's dominated with commercial players, is the effective one? And what are the mechanisms of doing that? I do not have the answers, but at least we are in a position where we are starting to really ask those tough questions and pay the price of not having given at least an answer. Right now, technically or practically speaking, yes, the US can do whatever they want and US companies can do whatever they want in space, but then at the cost of the opportunities that are much harder for others. And is that what we mean? So when we do play as a nonprofit, it's also a way of saying, maybe there is a different way we can complement. It's nothing against commercial players, and they clearly provide a value. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a commercial value on there. So how can we maximize the benefit for everyone?
And so that raises an interesting question. Clay's a very early stage, non-profit or project right now. But you can imagine, let's say, and hopefully Clay scales up and becomes fairly well used. We talked about, or Miki talked about the risk of space debris, and we know that there are different, satellite providers, for example, some of which create more debris because they don't have navigability, for example, of their satellites. Or they don't have the right information communication to other. Could you see a world where you would also talk about the ethical sourcing or ethical use of data, right? Where you actually source and have some sort of rating scale, so that Clay itself said we would only source data from ethical satellite providers that comply with a certain code of practice, and you would refuse data from others that are not complying.
And what is the cost? Like literally, like if I'm not mistaken, the only ways to get daily images of anywhere on Earth is Planet. And the constellation of domes they have do not have the capacity to avoid in short term the collisions. But that also gives us daily images of anywhere on Earth. If we force them to have these collision avoidance systems, they might not be possible to put them. So is this something we are okay with? Clearly they are. Are we? Is the world okay with those things? Maybe the answer is yes, because those daily images maybe turn out to be extremely useful in case of disasters. Or maybe the answer is no, because if there are collisions that might happen, or when they happen, then the cost of that affects everyone for many years to come. But again, this is not hypothetical. This is not an academic question or theoretical question. This is a real choice we've done, not asking the question. And the choice we've done is that it is okay. Is that okay?
In a way, kind of similar conversation we've been hearing lately in the news about AI, right? AI just boomed in the last, a year or two, but now we realize that it has a big environmental impact because the computational power is so large. And yes, AI has potential and, lots of may solve many issues and will give us answers to hard questions and all. So it has a benefit, but at the same time, at what cost, right? And we also, AI is so powerful, but many people are using it for, I don't know,
other things that they should not be using it for as well.
Right. So what's the cost versus the benefit? And I think that's kind of like, yes. I have there seems like lots of that, like trade-offs, I guess. Yeah.
And by the way, the answer is not the yes or no. The answer is the how we build it. AI uses a lot of resources, and that's a problem. But not using AI also has a lot of cost. When we see AI being able to do better forecast, like 1,000 times faster, like Microsoft Aurora, that means we have potentially 50 times more time when there's a hurricane coming to put people out of harm's way. So the cost of AI is clear for the missions to train that model, but the cost of not doing those AI is also something that's going to affect the community. So then the question is, okay, there is a cost. How do we minimize the cost? Are we okay with a world that is like 5 amazing, really, really large models from OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, and others? Or should we favor the creation of a longer tail or a smaller and smaller models specific for specific cases that maybe could be combined together or could be minimized? Play is an example of obviously the second. Play is an effort to say, hey, we have $5 million. Instead of having 10 small models of $500,000, why don't we make a non-profit that makes one model for $5 million and the emissions that carries, and then everyone can use those so that we don't need to do 10 times emissions for a model that is 10 times worse.
So this is interesting because it takes you and Clay into 3 ethical discussions, right? Number 1, kind of an ethical discussion about AI, right? Like the compute load, the energy. Should you have large or small? Should you only have one monopoly provider versus kind of competition? So there's one about AI. The second is about the source of your satellite data. Like, is it ethical provisioning? Who has actually been deploying those satellites? How, what was the fuel consumption or the carbon footprint of those satellites? That's kind of quite, and then the third is kind of the ethical use of that satellite. Were those satellites intended to serve, certain industries, for example, the oil and gas industries or defense industries, others that some people may disagree with, tobacco industry, or was it, designed to help with environmental challenges? So there are 3 kind of poles, and I guess it could be overwhelming operationally to then start to navigate. How do we see ourselves through that? Who is best placed to kind of host or regulate or facilitate these discussions? Because we now are no longer into this yes-no legislative regulatory framework. It's about business operating practices that will shift and change, involving trade-offs. Do you see a body in that place facilitating these discussions, or is that the need for a new sort of body to come in and help govern these conversations?
The practical answer is that the market is one of those regulators. I'm not saying it's the right regulator, but clearly the market itself is regulating because these commercial companies that invest so much money in doing that, they do that because they believe that the customers will reward them buying the products and services derived from those. So that's the de facto answer. Of course, there's also the de facto answer that we have bodies like UNOSA from the UN, which also aims to regulate that, or softer power like the World Economic Forum and others who convene and try to maximize the value of that. The reality is that, and then frameworks like ESG that came from the UN report to try to do those things. Probably the right answer is a combination of both, with carrots and sticks. And of course, the carrot of the commercial, the market, the consumers paying for something or not is one of them. But there are also sticks to do that. And in my head, comes down in AI or even space, should it be an IP play where there are products and services and reward research and development for doing these things? Should it be a commodity where there are some set of expectations of standards and we can change back and forth because it's not the thing itself, it's using the thing, so a commodity? Or should it be a public utility where it's much more regulated and there's this very strict expectation and standards? If it's a public utility, I can see mechanisms where the governance play. And if it's an IP play, then it's basically the commercial sector. The right answer right now is that it's 99% a market play. And I don't think that's the right balance.
Excellent. Well, Bruno, we've come to the top of the time that we have over here, and you've given us a very heavy question to consider. That right now is primarily a market play. We need a balance. We don't know what that balance looks like, but this certainly gives us food for thought. Miki, do you have any reflections on the discussion we had with Bruno today?
Yeah, and I have my thought is that like we really need to have this conversation, right? I mean, here in the podcast too, but then as the community of clay expands, right? I think we will probably start hearing more voices from different sectors, different players, and now it is a market play, but then if the voice gets amplified, then that will start having more, I guess, authorities to come in. But then another point that I really want to take home, personally, is that there is a designability to it. How can we, make it so that it's, there is opportunity, but also there is certain rule that people can abide by, so that we could all benefit from that. And there's a designability, and the conversation is where we can start. And that's my takeaway. And I'm grateful for this conversation.
Excellent. Having intention with how we approach space. Bruno, thank you very much for your time and sharing your insights with us. And we were delighted to have you on today's podcast and look forward to our next discussion. All the best with
For sure.
Clay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.